Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. I'm Matteo Bonomi, Research Fellow at Istituto Affari Internazionali. I will be the chair of today's panel on EU differentiation, democracy, and the Conference on the Future of Europe. First of all, let me thank the European Commission for the support of this initiative. Since this webinar has been organized in the framework of EU-funded Horizon 2020 projects, starting from EU IDEA, EU integration and differentiation for effectiveness and accountability, that is coordinated from my institute, Istituto Affari Internazionali, in collaboration with INDIV-EU and EU3D. All these three Horizon 2020 project works on EU and differentiation, and we are cooperating together in another project that is called DICE. So please visit all our website. I'm particularly glad to be here today with such distinguished scholars on European integration that really need no introduction, such as Professor Birgit Lafan, the director at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Fiesole in Florence, Sergio Fabbrini, Dean of the Political Science Department at Luis University, and John Eric Fossum, Professor of Political Science at the Arena Center for European Studies in Oslo. And of course, Nicoletta Pirozzi, Head of the European EU Politics and Institution Program at Istituto Affari Internazionali here in Rome, and coordinator of EU IDEA project. So without further ado, I would ask Nicoletta if she could give us some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. Good afternoon, and it is a pleasure for me to convene and to speak at this event, which will address two concepts which are particularly important and relevant for our EU IDEA project, namely differentiation and democracy, and to talk about the possible implications for the Conference on the Future of Europe. So from my side, I will briefly tackle these two concepts as we address them in our project and the implications for the conference, and then I will listen to our great panelists to understand what the other projects are thinking and doing on differentiation and democracy. So first of all, in our EU IDEA project, we take a broad definition of differentiation in the European Union. We define it as any modality of integration and cooperation among member states, but also non-member states and sub-state entities to work together in non-homogeneous and flexible ways. So this quite complicated definition is just to grasp the full spectrum of possible implementation of differentiation within the European Union, which can be instances of integration, such as in the case of the Economic and Monetary Union, but also instances of looser intergovernmental cooperation, as in the case of the European semester. And we also acknowledge that this differentiation can lead to disintegration, as we experience with the Brexit issue. So while we consider differentiation as a possible way forward to accommodate diversity in the European Union and promote also further integration in some sectors, we also recognize that this differentiation can further widen the democratic deficit within the European Union. And in fact, if we think about differentiation, we realize that this can cause some incongruence between those who take decisions at EU level and those who are affected by them. So citizens and sometimes even governments may have only marginal control over the decisions and policies that affect their daily lives. Another issue that arises very clearly from differentiation is that it can lead to more complexity in the European Union system and thereby less transparency. and this can endanger legitimacy of the decision-making process in the eyes of the European citizens. Therefore, we think that in a scenario of differentiated integration, parliamentary representation at national and European level must be matched with additional mechanisms that can guarantee accountability of the European Union through legal channels, for example, but also administrative channels or social channels. And above all, what is needed from our view is a constant and real involvement of European citizens through information, consultations, and political dialogue as a prerequisite for decisions taken at the European Union level. At this stage, in particular, after the dramatic COVID-19 experience, we think that it is of utmost importance to ensure that European citizens are able to say what they prefer and what is their view about the direction of the European Union integration process, including differentiation, because these issues in the end have a tangible impact on their capacity to participate in the democratic process of the European Union and also to hold the decision makers accountable for their decisions. In this direction, we think that the Conference on the Future of Europe, which, by the way, held its first plenary session just last Saturday, the 19th, represents a unique opportunity for citizens to debate about the future of the European Union and also to give indications on the way forward. In this regard, we think that political leaders should be ready to face uncomfortable truths by European citizens about their preferences on the overall direction of the European Union project, because these preferences can lean towards a federal union, so to more supranational institutions, to more competencies of the European Union, to a consolidation of the community method, but they can also ask for a reinforcement of national sovereignty in sectors that have not been addressed in the right way by the European Union, for example, migration or even vaccines. Such an outcome, of course, would favor the Eurosceptic and nationalistic forces, which undeniably play a significant role within the European Union in these times. For example, this can lead to further negotiations for opt-outs from the European Union legislation, although also in some cases to consider abandoning the Eurozone and the European Union as such. Between these two extreme scenarios, we have a scenario of differentiation in which willing and able member states can come together and put forward policies in specific sectors to enhance the integration process, while leaving the door open to other member states that want to join later. However, we acknowledge that it is particularly difficult to present and explain the pros and cons of differentiation to European citizens. On one side, we have the academic debate on differentiated integration, which have been characterized by different concepts ranging from concentric circles, core groups, multi-speed Europe, Europe à la carte, and which has added confusion among the general public. And on the other side, we have the political level, where differentiated integration has been often presented as a path towards the creation of first and second class member states, or more recently as a way to accommodate the British request for exceptionalism. We think that a more pragmatic approach is necessary, specifically in the framework of the Conference on the Future of Europe, by analyzing differentiation within specific policy fields. And we do that in the EU IDEA project, analyzing differentiation in economic governance, in migration, in security, with a view to assessing the limits and the potentials of institutional arrangements and also the policy practice of differentiation. This method would allow to simplify the ongoing debates about the benefits and risks of differentiated integration, but also to bring it closer to the European citizens with a view to let them understand fully the trade-offs implied by such a process. So we think that this can be done within the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And this conference can really lay the foundation for a new European Union in the future. However, to be truly effective, these events need to be turned into a real engagement of citizens in the direction, as concerned the direction, but also the purpose and the ambition of the EU integration process. And such a process may ultimately lead to a reform of the European Union, even a reform of the treaties. But what it is essential is to make this process rest on an active and constant engagement of citizens and societies in the European Union. So I think this would be one of the primary objectives of our action and reflection in the year ahead. And I'm curious to learn and listen to the experiences of fellow colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Thank you. Certainly, as you have highlighted, it's not easy to explain differentiation. With this aim, I will open the floor and give the floor to Professor Fabbrini, that I'm sure he can help us understand better this notion.
Thanks very much. In order to help myself more than help you to understand, I used a very short PowerPoint. And I would like to work on the question raised by Nicoletta. I follow suit her presentation. Here, a very short roadmap on the issue that we are discussing. What do we mean for differentiated integration? And of course, you understand we have a different two concepts. One is the concept of integration, which is wide open, can be used, as Jon Erik wrote a very important, influential article a few years ago. All political systems are differentiated. And the other concept is differentiated integration, which is a concept that we can apply only to the European Union experience. And how has differentiated integration affected democracy? That is crucial for those working on differentiation. Which are the democratic implication of differentiated integration? Of course, when you start a research or a paper, a book, you need to make clear your theoretical premises. In my case, is of course I use a classical established concept of democracy, at least as elaborated by Dahl, where democracy at least should guarantee transparency, as Nicoletta explained, and accountability. And at the same time, I am and we are all very well aware of what Giovanni Sartori continued to explain to us as a student, that we have to be careful about conceptual stretching. Differentiated integration can be, like differentiation, one of those concepts used in all contexts, in every situation, and we have to prevent and avoid this one. Okay, so at least we have differentiated integration while individual member states are formally exempt from respecting legal rule or policy regime. So differentiated integration means that in some policy area or in some legal regime within the European Union, some member states are exempted to participate. However, when we talk about differentiated integration, we need to distinguish between a differentiated integration induced by a lack of capacity. The member state entering the European Union doesn't have the sufficient administrative capability, doesn't have the legal structure for adopting the acquis communautaire, and the sovereignty motivated differentiated integration. And here is significant for us, because a lack of capability can be temporary, specific, where if I raise a sovereignty issue, then we are facing a more stable, permanent phenomenon. Okay, so which are the implications of of this. But just give you an example of differentiated integration. We have, of course, in the post-Maastricht era, with the 1991, 1992, we have the integration of what two scholars, Genschel at the UI and Jachtenfuchs at the Art School, core state power. So when the core state power, like foreign policy, security, home affair, or the economic side of the Eurozone moved to Brussels, to the European Union, some member states started to oppose resistance. And because those core state power affected their own idea or myth or reality of sovereignty. So the integration of core state power has raised sovereignty-based issue and cleavages. And this is the most significant phenomenon, at least from my reading, of differentiated integration. Differentiated integration emerged as when we needed to move on in the integration to centralize policy making in Brussels, at the same time let some member state not to enter in that process of Brusselization of the policy making process. So in order to deal with this sovereignty-based issue, I use the concept of sovereignty because sovereignty has become a new, very prominent let's say, a realm of division. Till the 90s, we didn't talk about sovereignty issue regarding the development of the common market or the single market. The sovereignty issue emerged in the following decade, in particular in the last 2 decades. And the strategy for dealing with sovereignty-based issue were basically 2. One, legal. So we create a specific legal regime, the Economic and Monetary Union, or Schengen. And the second strategy is to create a governance differentiation within the European Union, within the differentiated European Union. So we have, with the 90s, the gradual institutionalization of what now we call intergovernmental governance, which has not substituted the supranational governance of the single market, nevertheless has become competitive and in tension with the supranational governance. So indeed, it is also interesting that we consider that the European Union is at least constituted by 2 unions. One union is the market union, the single market with the Commission, the Parliament, the European Parliament, the Council, and then there is this intergovernmental union in core state power issue. The implication of this formation, of this intermingling between the sovereignty-based issue and their intergovernmental management has been the incredible, in my view, expansion of the intergovernmental logic in the European Union decision-making process. And this intergovernmental logic relies basically on the European Council. The European Council is the winner of the process of differentiated integration in the core state power policies, exactly as I consider the European Parliament the winner of the institutionalization of the co-decision-making procedure in the single market regulatory policy. By the way, the 2 institutions, the European Council and the European Parliament, were not present in Rome in 1957. The European Parliament was a secondary institution and the European Council was an informal club of people, premier or president of the Republic meeting for discussing some issue. So this is interesting. The institutional evolution and transformation of the European Union led to this affirmation of these 2 institutions. But regarding differentiation integration, of course, we are dealing with the question of to whom is accountable the European Council and how does it take the decision within is collegial logic. The European Council is more than a crisis manager. It's become a collegial executive. It is a sort of holistic institution. This raised very crucial issue for democracy, because it's certainly through differentiated integration, we had more integration, but we have also to consider if that more integration is being paid with less democracy. Okay, yeah, I finished. So we need probably to have a new paradigm to think about. The new paradigm are useful for evaluating the reality. Without alternative paradigm is impossible. Again, Giovanni Sartori, to understand reality. And here you have to think, if you have to move few competencies at the center without governance differentiation, and more competencies at the national level, letting the member state to have policy differentiation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Fabbrini. I would ask then John Eric Fossum, Professor, how do you think that this challenge can be faced at the conference of the future of Europe, and how would you relate this with your project on differentiation U3D?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the interesting question, Matteo. I will start a bit by saying something about how the EU3D project is approaching the relationship between differentiation and democracy. And after all, the three Ds are democracy, dominance, and differentiation. So we kind of built this into the project. And I will pick up by starting on the distinction that Sergio Fabbrini made between differentiated integration and differentiation. Because in a certain sense, differentiated integration is a kind of deviation from the sort of standard understanding of differentiation that is associated with the general development of modern political systems. So all political systems are differentiated. That's the whole point about the development of modern systems. But the EU is distinctly differentiated. And that's precisely because the process of integration has generated all kinds of deviations. And the system itself is also in a sense, deviated from the way we think about differentiation in the normal nation-state context. And the beginning on the general understanding of differentiation and democracy is that democracy requires differentiation. It requires a differentiation of functions from Montesquieu of the division of powers to prevent accumulation of power in one set of hands, to divide between executive, legislative, and judicial powers. It requires the development of specialized knowledge, because democracy relies on expertise and knowledge, as long as it doesn't become technocratic. So that in a sense, there are both functional, territorial, and legislative, and even rights types of differentiations that are necessary for democracy. However, the problem is that some forms are detrimental, and they can be associated with domination. So the whole point and purpose of this EU3D project is to develop a theory that allows us to sort between those forms of differentiation that are conducive to democracy and those that are conducive to domination, that is pathological for democracy. That's basically the orientation of the project. And the project is first having a diagnostic aim to try to understand how the European Union, not only in connection with the Eurozone and refugee crisis, but also the pandemic now, what kind of pathologies are based into it? What forms of differentiation are associated with dominance, with illicit forms of hierarchy, with that is undemocratic forms, intransparency, informality, inequality, and unfairness, distributive problems, and so forth. So that's a kind of diagnostic aspect. And then it also looks forward-looking to look at the debate on the future of Europe. And here is where the conference comes in as an intrinsic element of this type of undertaking. So we are actually examining citizens' opinions. So this was designed before the conference started. We're examining citizens' opinions. We look at parliamentary debates. We look at the media as transmitters for and reforms. And we also are collecting a broad range of proposals from before the conference started. And then we situate this in a context and look at this in relation to what the conference is doing. So then to go specifically to how we approach the conference, we certainly also will go in and look at the reform proposals that are being plowed into the conference to see what kind of reforms they have. And we are, of course, interested to find out what kind of constitutional visions we can identify, as Sergio was pointing to the federal vision and Nicoletta as well. So we want to find out what kind of constitutional visions are coming out in the debates on the conference. We also are, of course, interested in the conference as a democratic reform process. And what is interesting is that the conference was designed as an attempt at instilling democratic and governing reforms by an explicit democratic method, with quite a strong bottom-up element of citizens' panels and participation. And that then is intended to combine that with representative democratic process. So that's sort of, that type of design is of course important, not only in terms of looking at the proposals, but also looking at the process. So we also therefore need to understand the possible pitfalls associated with this. Namely, will there be enough of a citizen participation to make the exercise credible? Numbers count. What kind of orientation across Europe will one see from this? Are certain biases very readily apparent, that voices are not being heard from some places and across the political spectrum, so to speak. So the representativeness of this exercise in itself will be an element when we are looking at the process of reform. Is the process structured to support such an undertaking? Of course, that presupposes that there is a link between citizens' participation and EU reform, and that citizens are able to see this. And that means that there needs to be a kind of commitment by the institutions involved that they actually do something and act on the citizens, and that they show this. And actually showing this, of course, is a complicated exercise, but it's important in terms of the democratic legitimacy. So the more the conference is flagged as a kind of democratizing undertaking, the more important it is that this type of link is being made visible. And of course, it presupposes the ability and the development of a clear reform agenda emanating from this, and that citizens somehow can identify with this. So something has to be flagged from the beginning of these citizens' exercises or the plenaries to show that there is a kind of reform agenda developing on this. And of course, will the institutions be willing and able to do this when we realize that the institutions have roots in quite different worlds, so to speak? We have written, Sergio, Magda Goa, Gunther Wolf and I have written a piece on this where we argue that the Parliament, the Commission and the Council have kind of roots in different worlds. Like the Parliament has certainly its feet in the democratic participation logic, representation, participation logic. The Council has its roots in international diplomacy, and with that secrecy much more prominent. And the Commission has its root in an expert body and with a hankering towards technocracy. So these are different understandings of institutional worlds, basically, and the question of harmonizing this. So the further element is that also the important is how the conference and to what extent the conference is able to engage with the ongoing measures that the EU is taking on the next generation EU and so forth, and the measures that are taken to deal with the pandemic. What type of time scales are there for reforms, and is the conference itself designed so that the time scales is in sync with the reform processes, or is it out of this? What kind of engagement can it actually have with this ongoing reform process? And further, the conference as a means for connecting or harmonizing national debates to a more coherent European debate. And we have been examining parliamentary debates in a number of years before the conference started to get a handle on what type of debates, how coherent or diverse segmented they are across Europe. And we will then be able to say something about the extent to which the conference can work as a funnel to unify these and direct this as a development of a more clearly established European public sphere. So we need to therefore see how it interacts with other ongoing reform debates, to what extent the conference connects with the discussions in the parliament and publics, or whether the conference in the end ends up being more like an ongoing consultation that the Commission has had with citizens before. And lastly, it's also possible, I think, to think about the conference as a challenge for democratic theory. especially with regard to clarifying the relationship between participation and representation. And we had a debate with Manfred Weber last week, and I think he brought this up very, very nicely. Because if you go back and look at how citizens panels and citizens assemblies are being discussed, they are normally considered as complements to existing arrangements of representative democracy. And what I think is happening in the EU is that now this participatory mode with citizens panels and so forth is used as a vehicle to reinforce or to develop properly democratic reform, representative democracy. So this is kind of opposite of what you normally find in the general literature, where the citizens' participation is understood as a complement to the established, well-functioning representative systems. In the EU, there is a lack of proper connect through parties and so forth to citizens, and now they are using these citizens' panels and so on as an attempt to try to build this. And the question is, how far can this be? And to what extent is this to some is putting the cart in front of the horse, especially if the expectations to the citizens' participation are unrealistic and not sufficiently geared towards ensuring the reform of the representative institutions. So I'm actually, in that sense, concerned also about not overloading the citizens' participation and so on with expectations, and making sure that the conference itself is focusing on making sure or on ensuring that the basic infrastructure for representative democracy is being put into place. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this very interesting point. And I would give the floor to Professor Lafan to ask her what is her perspective on this of this issue, and how INDIV-EU is dealing with differentiation, democracy, and the Conference on the Future of Europe.
So first, let me thank you for the invitation, and it's always a pleasure to participate with my good colleagues that I see on this Zoom. Well, whenever the future of Europe is debated, or whenever there is the prospect of a treaty change, almost inevitably differentiation and mostly differentiated integration makes its way onto the agenda, even if it's not formally part of the agenda. Why? Because the EU is already a system of differentiated integration, and DI has been accentuated in the EU, driven by two factors historically: one, enlargement, and the other, the expansion of treaty competence into core state powers. It is one of the ways, but only one of the ways, that the EU has dealt with heterogeneity. So in terms of INDIV-EU, the project that I participate in, that we coordinate from the Schumann Center, what we wanted to do at the beginning was to get a very granular understanding of just how much DI was in the EU system over time and how it operated. And then to go on to what works, what doesn't work, and also both in the knowledge base to make sure that we had good databases on all of this, but then also the evaluative criteria, the normative. So 4 things stand out from a database that started with the Rome Treaty and has observations on every form of DI that has happened. Firstly, it expanded treaty-based differentiation, expanded significantly after 2000. So it comes with that, not Maastricht, there was a jump in Maastricht, but really after 2000, the Big Bang enlargement. Legislative differentiation within the EU has expanded much more gradually across time, and enlargement has also been one of the key drivers. Now, for me, one of the findings that for me is counterintuitive is that most DI in the EU is multi-speed, and that after 5 years plus, 83% of all instances of DI have expired. In other words, there is a lot of churning in DI, and I think we as scholars need to reflect on this, because we tend to focus on the elements of DI that persist, but we don't pay enough attention to the fact that the multi-speed really is a feature of this. But of course, it's not all multi-speed. And that brings me to the multi-tier. And the multi-tier, the most significant example of multi-tier DI in the system is obviously the Eurozone. That is the one that is, it's large, it's inclusive. New states have been able to join the Eurozone. So there is a multi-speed element, but there also is a multi-tier element. And through the crisis added additional elements of DI to the Eurozone governance. So it is, and because of its centrality, that the leap to establish a single currency, the lock-in effect of a single currency, is such that it, in a way, is the dominant form of DI in the system. And it is one where you have very complex governance structures, both with the Eurozone, the relationship of the Eurozone meeting as Eurozone, the Eurozone, but also the inclusive formats of the system. So that is where one needs to pay attention to, is given the weight of EMU for the member states who are parts of the single currency, going back to what John Eric said, is there elements of domination there? Is there adequate political accountability and democracy within for the governance regimes that specifically focus on this? But there is another interesting finding that we've had, and that's, in fact, Yachten, Fuchs and Genschel they have a work package where they've specifically looked at core state powers and the way in which non-involved states, the opt-out states, the way in which they attempt to what they call reintegrate. And what's very interesting is countries use reintegration opportunities much more, again, than we have recognized in the literature. In other words, Denmark, and I'm reading here because I've literally, these results have literally come in the last 24 hours, but Denmark would use 65% of its reintegration opportunities. Ireland, much higher, 89%, Sweden 57%, but even the UK was using 76% of its opportunities to participate in areas that they had formally opted out of. So I think what we're seeing here is a much more complex set of governance regimes around DI than the simple insiders, outsiders, and multi-speed, multi-tier. Now, the area where we also have a work package on governments and citizens, and we've completed the governance element, but we haven't completed the work on citizens because there's an experimental aspect to the work package. And that's where we want to get at how citizens look at trade-offs in DI. So again, that's an area that unfortunately I'm not able to report on. But moving on to the conference on the future of Europe, it strikes me that the method, the processes, the attempt at citizens panels and citizens engagement is an attempt to at least democratize the process of a discussion on the future of Europe, which is not the case if we think back to the Single Act or Maastricht or whatever. So there is an attempt via process. But when I look at the substantive issues on the agenda of the conference, then they're all big policy areas. They're not about process. There is a bucket called democracy, but it's not that linked to the other substantive areas. So again, I wonder what the integration will be in the discussion on democracy within the EU and those big ticket items of climate, digital, et cetera, that appear to me to be the core focus of the conference on the future of Europe. So in the discussion, what likely role is differentiated integration? What likely role is it going to play? Well, I would argue that on most of the area of the substantive policy areas, then differentiation is not the solution. So if one looks at the rule of law, and that's a fundamental challenge to the EU, but you cannot have differentiated opt-outs of Article 2 of the EU, or else the EU should close shop. I mean, it's either it's a community of values, a community of law, and a community of democracy. If you move to climate, then you might have multi-speed uses of different instruments in the climate field, but you cannot have, given externalities, you cannot have opt-outs out of the Green Deal. And then finally, to public finance and solidarity. And so one could have envisaged that in response to the pandemic, that you could have had an RFF that was Eurozone only. But in fact, the system responded by wanting an EU response a la 27. And that means that linked to the MFF, so again there where there was the possibility, and in my view, it would have happened had the United Kingdom been members, the EU has opted for the 27. So I think when thinking about the substantive policy areas of the future, is DI the response to, does DI allow the EU integrate further if a majority of member states want to, in many more areas? So again, that's a question. And then I think in design terms, multi-speed is better than multi-tier, because the EU, the more open it is to its member states and to the possibility that the system will remain inclusive and open, that matters to the democratic fabric of the EU and the meaning of membership. And then finally, just one sentence on external DI. The Conference on the Future of Europe has a Europe in the World basket. And one of the areas that I imagine is going to surface there is the relationship between the EU and its neighbors. And if we look at Switzerland and the UK, then these relationships are very unsettled at the moment. So again, what are the likely principles that will develop in order to promote good relations with non-member states while maintaining the unicity of the EU and the importance of membership? So to what extent should the EU be required to reset its relationship with the outside, with its neighbors on the outside? And there is a democratic element to this. Or does it privilege the internal dynamic and fabric of democracy within the EU itself? My hope for the Conference on the Future of Europe is that the method will move the EU along. I'm hoping it's not just consultation, because I think if it remains at the level of a sort of a stakeholder consultative process, then I think that will be an opportunity missed. Whether we can get panels and all of that as part of the way in which the EU approaches, strengthens its democratic fabric, all the better. But I do think participatory and representative democracy must always be held, albeit intention must also be, they both matter. And I leave it at that.
Thank you. I would invite people from the public, if they want to ask questions, to put on the Q&A section as a chat. And I would take my chance to put a question myself for the moment. I mean, to a certain extent, certainly the conference, the declaration of the conference of the future of Europe, calling the conference reflect the logic of different institutions that launch it. And so how this reflects on the conference, and which are, according to you, the condition for the conferences to become a real instrument for reform? And if you see some risk on the other side. And I don't know if also Nicoletta wants to add something.
Do you mean, Matteo, to reply to your question? I cannot hear you, but let me start by replying to your question, and then maybe I would add something more. Just a couple of minutes to say that, in fact, some of the gaps and the potential problems of the conference are caused exactly by the fact that the main EU institutions could not find an agreement about the setup of the conference, and most importantly about the objectives of the conference itself. We have seen it during the preparation period of the conference. We had two very clear positions. On one side, the position of the European Parliament, which wanted an ambitious conference leading to a reform of the European Union and a reform of the treaties. And on the other side, the Council of the European Union, which explicitly excluded any possibility to include the reform process of the treaties within the scope of the conference itself. This led to confusion. This led to a very Byzantine governance structure for the conference, and in the end risked to jeopardize this exercise of democracy, and also to delay indefinitely the start of the conference itself. Now we have a sort of agreement, but still we are not clear about the outcome and the objective of the conference itself. And I think that what Brigitte was saying, the fact that if this conference results in a consultation, this is a missed opportunity. I will go even further and say that this could be a real boomerang for the European Union, because we have been talking about this conference for months. We have raised expectations of those European citizens that are aware of the conference itself. Now it is time, I think, for the European Union to give a space for citizens, not only to discuss and to consult, but, as I said, to state a clear preference on the direction they want for the European Union. So the real challenge is then to transform this preference in this direction into concrete reform. This can be an initiative, a proposal by the European Commission, or can go further and be a real reform, a reform process of the treaties. But in any case, the European Union institutions need to find a way to deliver and to meet the expectations of the European citizens.
I would also add to this question also, Luca Tacconi is asking if it is really possible to reform Europe without treaty changes. So I will add this to this other question, and maybe I would repeat the first order. So ask Professor Fabbrini if he wants to share his thoughts on this issue.
Thanks very much, Matteo, and thanks to Istituto Internazionale for promoting this debate. I start from different premises than other colleagues. And the premises is the following one, that the European Union, especially as Brigitte said, with enlargement and the deepening of integration, but with enlargement in particular, not only the last enlargement, 2004, 2007, but also the previous enlargement to the north part of the continent, has become differentiated in terms of views regarding integration. The 2020 political process, which led to the Next Generation EU, made clear that you had at least 3 different areas of member state, different section, sub-region, you can call as you like, pursuing different perspectives. One of these three areas is represented by the so-called sovereignty coalition, represented by Orban, Hungary, and Poland. Just yesterday, Orban made this incredible speech in which he said, yes, I am in favor of treaty reform. So I want the conference on the future of Europe reform the treaty, but my reform of the treaty imply the downsizing of the European Parliament, the squeezing of the Commission, and the increased competencies to the national level. So when we talk about treaty reform, we give for granted that treaty reform are supported by those who want to increase integration. This is no longer the case. It's not a question of multi-speed. Here there are differences in terms of consistent view of integration. And so it's not the question of reform per se. My issue is what kind of reform. And I close here a long story. Is it possible to accommodate within the union project the interest of countries like Hungary or the view of leaders like Orban with the view of leaders like Draghi or Macron? That, in my view, is the differentiated integration is no longer sufficient, it seems to me, for dealing with Orban requests. We want to downsize the role of the European Parliament. We have to find a different view, a different road for keeping this country within, let's say, a common project. We have to change the paradigm. But I don't want to make a long story here, but that is the challenge. Those people are not supporting a different speed. Those people are supporting a different union. And this different union is going against the ever closer union of the preamble of Rome. It is Hungary, it's not Britain, so they cannot become independent. They don't have an empire on the back or within their own mind. So they will be inside. So this is why we need to deal with this challenge in terms of finalité. And that is, I think, the question of differentiated integration should be reframed for dealing with that. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe Professor Folsom, do you want to add something on this?
Thanks. Yes, I'd like to pick up on what Nicoletta said first, and also the risks here, because it is, I think, if you compare the conference with the Convention on the Future of Europe, the Convention on the Future of Europe was operating at an arm's length from the EU institutions. This conference is the direct creature of the institutions, and they are directly accountable for it. And therefore, any kind of upset or whatever will feed straight back on the institutions. And that's also why the extent to which they can sing with to the same tune is important, because it will reflect on the European Union as a political system in a much more direct manner than if it had been in a body set aside. Normally, these constitutional types of reforms are hived off to separate bodies that are operating on the side of sort of normal conduct of politics. And that's also why I asked about the relationship between the conference and the ongoing reforms, because this is associated with the normal operation of the European Union. So this is a tricky one in that sense of finding out exactly what kind of space it's supposed to be operating in. So there is the possible downfall of accountability, that they can be held much more directly accountable because they are so directly involved in it. I understand the onus on policy. However, I think there is a question of pedagogy involved in this too, because as for the question on treaty reform, it would be important to get a sense also from the institutions themselves of the extent to which they see that certain types of procedural bottlenecks are necessary in order to get substantive policy reforms. So the two are not separate. If you change voting rules from unanimity to forms of majoritarianism, you open up scope for reconfiguring the relation between policy areas in a dramatic sense, as we have seen with the development of qualified majority voting. So the procedural and the institutional provisions that are locking down policy areas or capacity building and so on, that seems to be a very necessary thing to do, and could be helpful in seeing what is at stake, so that some forms, I think, of these types of procedural reforms are more important. And if one develops the agenda, one needs to prioritize some of these. And I think that's one of the tasks. Instead of having a broad repertoire of policy areas, I think one should also look at what kind of policy implications do certain types of institutional and procedural reforms have. Finally, on the issue of treaty reform, I understand Sergio's point. And we know this also from these complex reform processes, that constitutional reforms, larger ones that have this type of symbolism, can become garbage can processes. They can become extremely unwieldy, and therefore they require a very deft form of leadership. And there are risks involved in this, in the sense that things can unravel. So certainly if one embarks on something like this, also one needs to have a clear procedure set out for how to deal with it, so that one can manage the agenda. And this is an issue of leadership. And I think that's one of the critical aspects of the whole conference, rights on the issue of leadership. And I'm afraid, I think that there is something to the conference that is akin to the Yes Minister in the British TV series, that I am the leader, I must follow them. This idea of responsiveness doesn't work when we are facing significant challenges. Somebody needs to stake out an agenda and take responsibility for it, and then ask people to respond to that. And I haven't seen enough of that. And I think it is quite optimistic to think that the conference, especially the citizens panels and so on, should be able to develop this. Somebody needs to step forward and actually take that type of responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Laffen.
Well, I mean, I think the EU has a very clear strategic agenda. I think if you look at the whole Bratislava process and then the von der Leyen political priorities, they're very aligned. So it really is the big ticket items of digital, Green Deal, Europe's role in the world, and then the social contract, political economy. So I'm not sure the issue is about the big ticket, the agenda, the broad agenda. I think it's translating that agenda into action is clearly, because all of those issues are very complex and very big. And climate will require major investment of public monies. The public-private balance has to change in the world, and the pandemic has brought it some way, but it has to change again. So I think, I'm not sure that the agendas as such is the problem. I think it's more translating those high-level goals into action that can be agreed on both at EU level and at the member state level. Can I say that I agree absolutely with what Sergio said about that, what I consider a cancer in the EU at the moment, and that cancer is, Sergio, you're right, they're sovereigntists, but they're also authoritarians. They're not democrats. And so neither Hungary nor Poland, and Bulgaria it's not the only one, they would not be admitted to membership of the EU today with the policies and practices of the government, of their governments. And that is, in my view, the biggest challenge facing the EU today. And I'm not sure that a conference on the future of Europe can address that problem, that core problem. Now, there can contestation, can deliberation, can you get a sense in which that this that the EU institutions, I mean, the court has been much more active, for example, than the Commission on these issues. So I think that we shouldn't raise expectations of the Conference on the Future of Europe so that it is destined not just to disappoint, which the EU does with regularity, but is undermined. And so I think it is important that the EU experiments with different ways of engaging with citizens. And I think the citizens panels, at least at the level of idea, as you say, as John Eric said, numbers matter, process matters, and all of that. But what would we regard as a reasonable outcome for the fabric of the EU as a polity and a democracy for the next 10 years from the Conference on the Future of Europe? What's the minimal necessary, and then where's the high mark? But I think that if those of us who engage with the EU all the time as scholars, but also you hear it from NGOs, we have great expectations of the EU. And those expectations are usually dashed. So what helps steer the EU as a political system and a form of political order in a way where the fabric of democracy and engagement is stronger and enhanced, and also that it addresses those big ticket items that Europe has to address? Because of course, the future of Europe will be as determined by great power competition between the US and China as it will anything that's happening in the Conference on the Future of Europe. So I always worry when the expectations will go very high and we can write the script on what's likely to happen.
Thank you. I think our time is running, and I think we should go towards conclusion. And I don't know if Nicoletta wants to add something, but if I may, maybe I just to conclude, I can just conclude with a question. Can we imagine what would we say about Hungary if we wouldn't be in the EU? Or if Bulgaria and Romania were not part of the Union during the end of Euro-Atlantic integration, during the annexion of Crimea and so on. So just as a provocation, of course, I completely agree that it is probably one of the main issues, but just a bit of counterfactual reflection, just to instead of conclusion, that I'm certainly not able to sum up all the interesting input we received today. Thank you.
That went extraordinarily quickly.
Thanks very much to Yai. Thanks very much to Yai.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks to you. Bye.
Hi, I would want, I'd like to say one thing though. That is, when I talked about leadership, I was actually thinking more about managing expectations than necessarily the agenda as such. And I think I should have been more clear on that. But I think that this is really the problem, that they need to calibrate this. And I agree with you, Bridget, and this was actually my point about representative democracy. So, but I also actually, especially if this is going to be a reform process, they really need to prioritize, because you're not going to be able to use the conference for so many things. So, and I actually don't think the conference is going to be the biggest game anyway. But I'm concerned that this can be misused by people as another example of the EU barking but not biting, basically. So that's sort of the subtext.
Can I also say that I agree, Matteo, entirely with you on the authoritarians. I think we've got to stick with them in the hope it's episodic and that it will turn, because the western half of the continent, in my view, owes it to the eastern half of the continent. And otherwise, Russia would be running, you know, we can see the sphere of influence issue, but that doesn't mean that it really, it is undermining the EU dramatically, in my view.
Once Ivan craftily compared this as a sumo fight, it's about resilience, and so we should not move. And at the end, we will probably find the right way to but I don't know.
I also think we should also not underestimate what China is doing, setting itself up as a model of authoritarianism, and that these are also, I mean, these are also emulating. So this is a more problematic challenge in ideational terms than Russia is. Russia is meddling, but Russia doesn't have a model that works. China claims it has. So it comes in and it develops a new club inside of Europe as a kind of spreading the cancer. This seems to me to be this cohort of the two. And that of course means that, yes, I agree with Bridget that they should keep these countries, but they should also be put to a choice. And there should be a greater conditionality in terms of how they behave and so forth. And or in terms of the levers that one is using. But that comes with more capacity for the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you.
One has to unleash that type of capacity. Okay.
I would like to thank you once again for this very interesting conversation. I think now we really have to close. Goodbye. Yeah. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Ciao.
Ciao.